For those of you who don't know or didn't get a chance to read the bio, Julia Boorstin is a successful TV reporter. She works at CNBC, and she does a lot of reporting in the tech sector and the tech industry. And because of her position and because of her interest, she has had an opportunity to speak to thousands of executives, and in those conversations really come to understand that there still continues to be a significant gender gap in both leadership, but also opportunities and decision-making structure. So it's a real honor for us to welcome her here today. I have the honor of working with her on the CNBC Disruptor 50 Council, where I'm a member, and to learn from her and to engage in this conversation. So today's engagement is really about Julia sharing some of the insights and details, and time permitting, taking some questions from you. So before more time passes, I'm going to start the conversation by saying, Julia, welcome. And I'd love to start by hearing what was really the inspiration behind your wanting to write this book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It is truly an honor. I'm so grateful, and also so grateful to have been able to work with you on the Disruptor 50 Council. And I will say that, I'm such an admirer of your work. And the Disruptor 50 is actually where the inspiration for my book started. So I've been a business reporter for over 20 years. I've been at CNBC for 16 years. And one of my favorite projects at CNBC is over 10 years ago, I created this list of the 50 fastest growing and most disruptive private companies. And I wanted to do this because I was always fascinated by the entrepreneurial instinct. And I would just hear you talk about sort of the problem solving approach of entrepreneurialism. And that was really what I was fascinated by. And I wanted to figure out a context to talk about private companies that would make sense for CNBC's focus on public companies. And in creating this list, which Banu, thank you so much for being part of, we've really figured out how to identify these transformative technologies, these game-changing technologies, and also the way technology is being deployed across industries. But what I've always been fascinated by in this process is this idea that entrepreneurs can take on risk in a calculated way and come up with ideas that can be truly game-changing. And I always loved interviewing entrepreneurs. And as Banu mentioned, I have interviewed thousands of leaders, CEOs in my time. I was fascinated by the CEOs and founders I was interviewing as part of the Disruptor 50. And I noticed that the female founders and CEOs were in very small numbers, a tiny percentage of the overall group. But I also saw that they were solving problems differently. They were tackling different types of problems, and both their companies and their management styles were different. So I was fascinated by these rare female leaders in the startup space. And at the same time, I was struck by the numbers I was seeing about female leadership. And this is the thing, Banu, you know all too well. Female founders currently draw about 2% of all venture capital dollars. That is actually down from an average of about 10% over the prior decade. And I was struck by this disconnect. I was so impressed by the approaches and focus of the female leaders. And at the same time, I saw how little access to capital they were getting. I wanted to tell their stories and to make sure that some new patterns of what leadership looks like were getting out there. So this started off as a storytelling venture, me wanting to share the inspirational, surprising stories that I was hearing from these women when I was interviewing them. And then that led me down this rabbit hole of really digging into the research of understanding how is it that these women are leading in different ways? What are the skills and strategies that female leaders are more likely to deploy? And what can we all learn from them? The women who have succeeded in the business world have succeeded despite the odds, particularly in the world of tech. And so I wanted to combine these stories with the research to explain what it was that they were doing and the key takeaways.
I'm really appreciative of you contextualizing the research and saying, maybe you didn't set out to study women, but that's how we ended up where we are because we noticed the gaps. So I'd love to learn, what were some of the most memorable conversations you had as you were speaking to these different women leaders?
Well, I think it was interesting. And I have to say, I was doing this reporting and reporting out this book during the pandemic. And I think that's notable because I would say the pandemic has been the biggest test of entrepreneurship, of leadership, of business, and the biggest moment of uncertainty for our world since probably World War II. And so it was this remarkable moment to study business leadership. And at the same time, I feel like I had this opportunity to talk to people at a moment where they were incredibly reflective. Everyone was going through this crazy thing, trying to figure out their purpose, why they were doing what they were doing, how they wanted to manage their employees. And I feel very lucky to have gotten to do these interviews during this moment of great reflection. It's funny because when I was going back and fact checking the book and sharing the quotes I was going to use with many of the women I quoted, several of them said to me, "Oh my God, I can't believe I said that to you. I can't believe I was so open about all of these personal decisions and challenges I've had." And I think there was something really valuable to me about that. So there were a lot of really surprising moments because of that sort of raw honesty. But I think to me, there was a sort of through line of humility. And I've been really trying to figure out what are these common traits that these women have. And I think to watch this humility, but also this willingness to drive change during this moment of the pandemic, I think it really came down to sort of being so really impressed by the growth mindset of so many of the women I interviewed. And I could give perfect specific examples, but this sort of amazing balance of humility, understanding that they don't have all the answers, being very honest about what they don't know, and then the confidence to know that they could learn and adapt and change. And that combination of humility and confidence is what to me enables a growth mindset, which is essential, not just for entrepreneurs, but anyone in a leadership position.
No, that sounds fantastic, Julie. I think we'll maybe circle back if we have time to some memorable quotes. But I wanted to ask you another question, which is quite related to what you just, outlined. What were some of the biggest surprises, if any, that you had as you were learning from these women? Were there some of these unexpected insights that, you came to understand?
Well, so there are a couple key ways that women are more likely to lead than men are. These are not biological, these are socialized. And I think it's really important to outline the fact that these are things that anyone could embrace and follow because these are incredibly valuable leadership traits. I'm just going to run through a couple of them. Women are more likely to lead with empathy. Empathy can be practiced. The ability to understand what someone else might be thinking or feeling is not the same thing as kindness. I cannot tell you how many male executives I've spoken to since my book came out who have said, well, empathy is just the same thing as being nice. That is not true. Let's define our terms here, which is something I know that you all think a lot about in academia. This idea that empathy can be deployed for strategic gain in business. Another one is women tend to lead with a more communal approach, pulling in perspectives from across an organization rather than a top-down approach. Women are also more likely to lead with a divergent approach rather than convergent approach. So convergent approach would be rushing to find a solution to a problem. Women are more likely to pull on threads of things that may seem tangential, but can help them paint a bigger picture understanding of the situation. So I talk about that as in terms of understanding the forest rather than just rushing to focus on fixing the tree. And what's interesting is women tend to rank higher in terms of adaptability. And I would say these two things are intimately connected because if you've already taken the time to understand the forest, when the situation changes and you have to adapt, you're well positioned because you already understand the circumstances or some of the surrounding circumstances. And then there are a couple of other ones, but I would say the one that really struck me as surprising is gratitude. I, in my whole career as a business journalist, had never thought about gratitude as being a business skill or having anything to do with business. I always thought of gratitude as something you think about or celebrate when you're with friends or with family and in your personal life. But that really surprised me. When I was doing these interviews, there was this one week when I did about 4 or 5 interviews, and each woman I interviewed had expressed gratitude in some way or shape or form. Whitney Wolford, the founder of Bumble, talked about how grateful she was that she'd had this traumatic experience getting kicked out of Tinder and this lawsuit because, and the trolling that she suffered through afterwards, because it put her in a situation where she could found Bumble and have the perspective to do so. There were one woman who had been trapped after an avalanche in Mount Everest. And after that avalanche was forced to boil water to survive. And then she founded a company called Ketos, which focuses on water safety and preventing leaks. And she said, I'm so grateful I had that experience. I would not be grateful for being trapped on the side of Mount Everest, but for her, it gave her that insight that this is really the thing I want to focus on with my company. So I heard all these stories about gratitude, and then I looked for the research and dug into my LexisNexis account and found so much research about how gratitude correlates with patience. And if you practice gratitude, you're more likely to say, I'm okay where I am right now. I don't need to go for the near-term win. or the near-term payout. I could take the time and go for the longer-term outcome. And interestingly, women are more likely to celebrate gratitude and to practice gratitude and to enjoy the feeling of gratitude. And back to the idea that these things are socialized, when the researchers were trying to understand why men are less likely to practice gratitude or to enjoy the feeling of gratitude, many men said that was because they felt uncomfortable, like maybe they owe someone something. But to me, that's so interesting, this idea that if you actually make a point to think about what you're grateful for, you're not going to be distracted by near-term sort of maybe less meaningful opportunities, and you're going to be focused more on the long-term, more big picture ones. And that was one that really surprised me. Once I saw it in the narratives and in the stories, and I saw the research, and to connect those two, everyone should be practicing gratitude when they're running a business, because you're going to have better long-term outcomes.
Yeah, that's fascinating to link gratitude to patience, to being able to weather storms and longer term. So this really leads into my next question, which is, at the end of the day, what is it that we can learn from women leaders and deploy not only in our organizations and companies, but also in our personal lives?
I think that's a great question. I mean, when I entered the working world after college, there was a very finite and defined explanation of what business leaders were, what they should look like, how they should behave. And I've been talking to some people recently about all the business books on people's shelves. And when I was a young reporter at Fortune magazine, good leadership was defined by Jack Welch and something that he called Six Sigma. And then there was this whole generation of business leaders who tried to emulate him. And this was a philosophy of cutting the bottom 10%. Communal leadership, empathy, vulnerability were not part of that conversation, to say the least. What's been notable to me about the success of these female leaders who have defied the odds, and the 300 academic studies that I went through and incorporate into this book, is that successful leaders are authentic to themselves and have a growth mindset. And the leaders who are not successful, or those who struggle, and I think about people like Elizabeth Holmes, who tried to act like a man and put on the costume of Steve Jobs and tried to be someone who many people say she wasn't, is that authenticity is key. But also, if you're authentic, if you're clear on who you are and what your skill set is, you're going to be better equipped to deploy a growth mindset. And so many of the women I saw succeed did so by not fitting into that box of what the archetype of a male leader, but by saying, I don't look or sound like that. Who am I? What am I good at? And how can I push myself to succeed in what I care about? Another thing about female founded companies is far more of them are likely to be purpose-driven companies than male-led companies. There's a lot of research about how having purpose can make companies far more successful, both in terms of attracting and retaining talent, but also in helping that entrepreneur or that founder succeed in the toughest of times. And so I think for me, what's been, there are so many different traits of leaders that have succeeded, but I think the key thing is understanding your own skill set, figuring out what you're terrible at and need to get better at, figuring out what you're good at and how to hone that skill, and then how to surround yourself with people who are going to complement you. But I think ultimately this idea of having a growth mindset and leadership comes down to not being someone else, but saying, here's what I'm good at, and here's the path that I'm going to put forward to be successful. And I think that that's true whether you're running an organization on campus or you're launching a crazy game-changing business. I think everyone needs to create their own goalposts and their own personal goalposts and figure out what they need to do to get there for their own path to success. So I think really differentiating and identifying that people should not be competing against each other, because everyone's standards, expectations, purpose is going to be a little bit different.
I appreciate that. And really trying to understand what industries can learn from women at scale. So my next question really is, based on conversations we've had, where in your conversations with male leaders, they would often say, well, is this really happening? Show me the data. And so based on that, what are those continued challenges women face as leaders in different industries or as they aspire to be leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just worth pointing out all the research about how if you are in a minority group, you're going to draw increased attention, scrutiny, and criticism. This is a theory called token theory. I'm sure you've heard about it, but if you only have one person in a room of 10 who's in a minority, that person is going to draw that increased attention, scrutiny, and criticism. Women are in the minority. People of color are in the minority when it comes to leadership positions in business, full stop. That is not debatable. If you look at the ranks of the Fortune 500, female CEOs currently represent 10% of the CEOs of the Fortune 500. That is an all-time high. It's up from 8% last year. There's also some question about whether more women are being put into these roles because of a phenomenon called the glass cliff phenomenon, where women are more likely to be put into a leadership position when a company or industry is in a precarious situation. So there's no doubt to me that women are in a minority position in leadership. The more rare they are, the more there is this assumption that they're not going to be good at that thing. And there's some interesting research that I cite in the book about how the less frequently you see a type of person in a certain role, the more you assume that that type of person is not going to be good at a certain type of role. And it plays into this whole token theory psychology. So I think that right now, the challenge that anyone who is not of the dominant homogenous leadership group, which is white men predominantly, has is that they're in a minority position. And until you get the people who are in that minority position into, what researchers call a critical mass, which is 20 or 30% of the total, the culture can't really change. So I think that's why it's so important that companies think about not just having one woman on their board or one person of color on their board, but what do they need to do to make their board truly diverse? So the culture can really change. So I think the challenges for women in business are persistent, and it's remarkable to me that here we are in 2023, and 10% of the CEOs of the Fortune 500 are women, and that's an all-time high. My solution for all of this really comes down to data, which is the same reason why I have 40 pages of endnotes in my book, and why I didn't just tell amazing stories of game-changing women, but I decided to explain their skills and strategies with a lot of academic research. Study after study after study has indicated that having more women in leadership, both at the C-suite of public companies, founder of startups, having women on the boards of companies, having women as CFOs, all of that leads to increased financial performance. I work for a business network. I'm a business reporter. I fully believe that if people understand that it's in their financial best interest for them to invest in diversity, then that's going to be a good argument to drive an investment in diversity. I think that the fact that in the past decade, the DEI conversation has in too many ways been about this is a nice thing for us to do, has taken away from the conversation that this is actually a financial imperative to invest in diversity and to have more women in leadership roles. So I think that's really what it comes down to, is looking at the data. And I also think data needs to be part of the solution in terms of hiring and promotion to make sure that you're hiring equitably and not counting on people having the best intentions to be, just counting on, well, of course, someone's not going to want to pay unequally. Just, I'm sure they're going to do the right thing. You can't assume that anyone, even women or people of color, are not going to have errors in their pay equity or in their promotion. So I think it's really important to use layers of data to pull out bias.
No, I appreciate that. And my final question before we sort of open it up for the audience is, you have done so much research, you've been in this industry a long time. What would you like to share with young people, young women, young men about leadership, particularly what we should be trying to emulate moving forward?
I think that I hope you read my book and you find some great examples in there. I think that young people right now, I hope, can do two things. Number one is to be optimistic that you can be successful by leading in your own way, and to not feel like you have to be constrained by the way things were done 10, 15, 20 years ago. There are a lot of opportunities right now in terms of technology being a sort of a democratizing force. So you can be entrepreneurial, you can define your own success, and you can also think meaningfully about how your own purpose is going to play into the equation. So I would encourage everyone to really think about purpose, but also having a social or environmental purpose to a company if they're interested in entrepreneurship. So I think that's my message, that I hope you're inspired and optimistic. But I also think on the flip side of that, it's very important to understand obstacles. I always thought if I just ignored the challenges, I could be more successful because I was just putting on blinders, working and forging ahead. But what I've come to understand through all of this research and also a lot of these interviews is that you can actually be more successful if you understand your obstacles. And it's for me, whether it was like biased comments that I was getting as a young reporter at Fortune magazine, or even comments that I get now, I think it's really important to understand institutional bias, not so it can be a bummer and depressing, but so you can better navigate those challenges. So I think even just like trying to get as much information as possible about pay or promotion, and just making sure you're feeding your data, like gather your own data for whatever environment you're in, because that's going to make you more successful. And I think when you see a challenge, don't shy away from it and try to ignore it. Try to understand it, because that's going to be the success, the key to overcoming that challenge.
Now, those are really wise words, and you all who came here will get books. They are delayed in shipping, so I encourage you to come back early next week and you will get a copy. I'm going to open up to folks who are here in person as well as those who are online for questions. Maybe we'll start in the room and then we'll navigate into the virtual space. So questions, comments, thoughts for Julia as we sort of head into the last about 15 minutes, because there's breaking news and she's actually got a segment.
My day job is I'm a media and technology reporter, so it's been a kind of crazy day.
I'm sure people see on CNBC, so you got a day job. So any questions, comments while we have Julia with us?
Hi, thank you so much for that. I'm really excited to read your book, and this was super insightful, especially as a young woman that wants to get into entrepreneurship and like into these spaces. I'm excited to learn more from you. I just wanted to ask a quick question about, I guess you touched a lot on the aspect of women entering these roles and like needing to feel authentic within themselves to be able to thrive. I wanted to understand if through your research you've found out that like how companies can create work environments that actually accept and like include women to be able to like be the best versions of themselves, because I guess a part of it is like women's leadership, but I wonder how to actually like train men to like
You mean sort of what should companies be doing right now?
Yeah, and like especially in terms of diversity training.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key part before you even get to diversity training is companies need to have a diverse workforce, and you can't just have one woman, one person of color in a big group. It doesn't work. Or those people are always going to feel marginalized and can't impact the culture if they're just one of them. It's interesting because I've talked to a lot of startups, and there's this organization, which I write about in the book, called All Raise, and another one called #Angels. And they're trying to make sure that companies have diversity before they get to a certain size. If you're a bunch of engineering majors, 5 guys who start a company, if you get to 20 employees and you don't have a woman, it's going to be really hard to hire a woman. So I think from the very beginning, as companies are growing, they need to think about the benefit and the necessity of having diversity from the very, very beginning. Not wait until they have 25 employees and then think about it. I think one thing that companies really need to do is make sure they're promoting and hiring equitably. There's been a lot of research about how the resume is a really outdated and broken way to hire people. And so there are some startups, including some that I write about in the book. One is called Pymetrics, that's based in New York. And what they do is they basically create games to test what your skills are and what your capabilities are, not what experiences you've had. And I think companies really need to change the way they're thinking about hiring, and also put in very specific criteria and timelines around promotion to make sure they're not hiring inequitably or promoting inequitably, which is what tends to happen. I mean, there's some amazing, I shouldn't say what tends to happen. I would say there's always a risk of that. But fascinatingly, the companies that have done the research to find out what errors there may be in pay equity have often found that they're not paying people inequitably. What they're doing is they're just promoting men faster than they're promoting women. And the 2 examples I'd point out are Salesforce and PayPal, both of which are run by white men, have both made a commitment to pay equity, and as part of that, equalizing promotion inequities. So it is possible, but at the end of the day, companies need to have an annual review of their pay and promotion to make sure that things are staying on track in terms of equity. And I really think that it all comes down to the data. Create systems where you can have data. You want to make sure you're not promoting the person who's banging on your door every week and asking for a promotion. You want to make sure you're promoting not the loudest voice, but the people who have earned that promotion. So I think that's really important. And then I think there are so many different policies that can play into employee retention, whether it's parental leave, encouraging men to take parental leave also, or even systems within rooms. And I talk a little bit in the book about how many of the women I interviewed told me they were introverts, and they created systems to make sure that everyone got a voice in a debate or a meeting before a final decision was made. So it wasn't just the loudest voice, an extrovert voice having the biggest impact. You want to make sure that everyone gets a voice if that's the goal, not just defaulting to the loudest voice. So I think there are a lot of things, both sort of structural and sort of logistical in the day-to-day that can improve those outcomes.
Thank you. I think we have a couple of questions online. So probably I can read that. There. All right. As a social work faculty member, I would like to have your perspective on how do you view entrepreneurship in the world of social services and other public or nonprofit domains?
This is something I'm really interested in, because women are so much more likely to found purpose-driven companies than men are. And by that, I mean a for-profit business that has some additional purpose, such as helping the environment or improving, social services such as healthcare, helping people in some way, shape, or form, in addition to generating profits. And I think for people who are familiar with the Tom's buy one, give one model, what's so interesting is the vast majority of purpose-driven companies have their financial success directly aligned with the success of their purpose. So in helping people, we are going to generate more money. One reason why women are expected to be more philanthropic than men. Women are expected to be more nurturing than men. Women do care about the environment and social issues more than men do, according to various surveys, but they're expected to care even more than they even do in terms of this sort of expectation of warmth and nurturing. One thing that's interesting is a number of women told me that they were incredibly ambitious. They want to have a big, successful company, but they felt like having an additional purpose made them feel more comfortable with acknowledging that drive and that financial ambition. And socially, women oftentimes feel uncomfortable talking about wanting to make a lot of money and wanting to be successful financially. And having that social purpose sort of neutralize that for many of the women I spoke to. And then additionally, a lot of women told me that they could have founded their company as a nonprofit, but they knew it would have a bigger impact if they could make it a sustainable for-profit business. So for instance, Tala, which is a microloans company that operates in emerging markets, there are plenty of microloans nonprofits, but the woman Shivani Soroya, who started it, she'd worked for the UN, and she saw how philanthropic dollars can come and go depending on the year. And she wanted to create an organization that would be successful and profitable regardless of where the philanthropic dollars where the winds of change were blowing that particular year or quarter. And so for her, she said, I want this to be a profitable, venture-driven company because we will be able to grow faster and accomplish more if we're not reliant on nonprofit dollars, on philanthropic dollars. So I think it's really important to shine a spotlight on the opportunity to both do well and do good at the same time through purpose-driven companies rather than just nonprofits.
Really appreciate that. We have another question online, which was, are you seeing women gravitate to certain sectors in the technology sphere over others? Which, did I get that right? Yeah, that's the question.
So I mean, I just mentioned purpose-driven companies. You see a lot of women in the environmental tech space, certainly a ton of women in the femtech space. This is female healthcare companies, both in fertility, female health in general, women's health in general, and then also in the menopause space has been a big growth driver recently. So to me, those are natural areas which have been overlooked by male investors for many years, and now you're seeing a rise of female startups in those spaces. Back to this idea of critical mass, we've also seen a critical mass of female leaders in the retail space. A number of female CEOs have really revolutionized the retail landscape, and many of those companies have gone public, notably The RealReal, Rent the Runway, and Stitch Fix. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen so many women succeed in that space. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that they've created new patterns for venture capital investors to say, okay, I was looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg, but maybe this woman is the next Katrina Lake, the founder of Stitch Fix. Maybe this woman is the next Jen Hyman. the founder of Rent the Runway. So I think that so much of the venture capital industry is determined at the very early stages before companies have revenue, profits, anything, even track record for investors to look at. So I think that there's so much of a bet on the individual that having more success stories within any sector is going to help investors identify potentially new opportunities by breaking them out of the stereotype that leaders are white men.
That's very helpful. Is there any question in the room? Because we have a lot online. Okay, so I'm going to come to the front for these two questions.
She can hear you. It's the back of the
Oh yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you for everything you said. It's been very interesting. My question is more a question about you, which is what skills or talents or curiosities or whatever it is has driven you to be able to notice these patterns that make women successful and really, look at a bunch of data and identify those traits you talked about that make women successul?
I would say this is a kind of a lame answer, but it really comes down to experience. I've been doing this a really long time. I was at Fortune magazine for 6 years. I've been at CNBC for 16 and a half years. And I couldn't have written this book. I don't think I could have written any book in the first 10 years of my career. And I think that, it comes down to, the Malcolm Gladwell idea of 10,000 hours of experience. But I think that, with the practice of interviewing people and seeing and learning, so much in my career, there is a certain element of now I can identify a trend because I've simply done enough interviews to be able to do it. So, I think that there's a real value to that and just doing the work. I mean, I could never have accomplished what I did in terms of the vast number of interviews I did. I think if it weren't during the pandemic, and I mean, I did 120 interviews. I used amazing transcription technology called Otter. If you guys haven't used it, there are these great transcription technologies. And so I would transcribe every interview. I would go back, listen to the interviews, and then I would pull out themes that I heard. And then that enabled me to take this massive stories and from the stories find the themes and then use the themes to find the data. So I think it was a lot of time spent, but also just I feel grateful for having been doing this for a long time. I think getting older is not fun in a lot of ways, but very grateful for the years that I've been pounding away at this business journalism thing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's really just great qualitative research skill set, right? Bottom up research, which we advocate for here. I know we had another question in the front row, so you can speak into space. Julie can hear you.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking your time to do the presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question pertains to what you said about leadership. As someone who's sort of went through different organizations and training sessions for leadership, I'm curious as to what you would say about the authenticity piece. Because often I feel like when you're in an organizational setting, especially one with a strong work culture, you sort of assimilate part of that and it becomes you, it shapes you, it shapes the way you lead, and also shapes the way you exist. So in that situation, how do you distinguish between what is quote unquote being yourself and what is just more or less taking on the culture and trying to direct it in a certain way? Like when do you cross the line?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I came across this fascinating research when I was working on the book about what they call cultural numbness. And I quote this in a chapter. This idea of cultural numbness is the longer anyone is part of a culture, the more they become oblivious to the flaws of that culture. And I talk a little bit about why women leaders or anyone who's been an outsider to the dominant culture has an advantage in that they're less likely to become numb to it because they are not of it, right? They are not so much of the culture. And I think that reading that, I had never thought about the concept of cultural numbness before, but once I saw the research, it totally made sense to me. And I do think that, and I do think it's valuable to sort of identify your own code of your own moral code, the things that matter to you, and be very clear about what your own personal goals are. So no matter what organization you're working in, you're going to maintain your own ethical standards, or even just your own priorities, because I do think that this concept of cultural numbness really makes a lot of sense. And sometimes it's not a bad thing. Sometimes people just fall into the culture. But I think different, especially startup cultures, can be very, very tight and very powerful. So I think it's really about identifying your own priorities, goals, skill sets, and I think authenticity is different from that. I mean, there are different cultures that prioritize extroverts. There's been a lot of research lately on the value of introverts, but I think just really understanding what matters to you and what your goals are, whether that's about the culture or whether that's about your priorities, I think that's essential. But I do think that I think you've touched on something important, and I think the more you can use an outsider perspective, the better. Outsider perspectives doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be painful to not feel like you're part of the club, and in many situations, I felt like the weird outlier because I was the only woman in the room. But the more you can reframe that to say, where am I an outsider in this situation? Where do I have a different perspective? And how can I use that to bring value to the group? That's where I think value creation comes from, is this understanding that just being part of the culture is not going to make you smarter. Bringing an outsider perspective is going to make everyone else in the room smarter as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for that, Julia. So we have two final questions online that I know that you have to get moving to your other job. So one of the questions is, have you come across any examples of particularly effective mentoring or networking opportunities for women in your research? And if so, what were some of the hallmark pieces of that? Were there particular curriculums or programming that you thought were effective? And then the final question, so you can mull on this too, is we have someone who is saying that they're a parent of 2 daughters. What is one piece of advice you would give to young women going off to college?
I'm going to do the last one first because I think it's easier. I would say try lots of things. Nobody knows what they're going to be good at until they try it. I didn't know. I fell into business journalism. I didn't know I was going to like business journalism. I didn't think I was going to be good at business journalism, but I happened to get a better job as a reporter at Fortune magazine than at Entertainment Weekly, where I was given like a fact-checking offer. And I think that you really just need to try a lot of things to see where you're going to shine. And sometimes the areas where you're going to find most success is something that you've never thought of before and never even would be interested in. But I think you just have to take the best opportunity, walk through the door that's open, even if it's something that you don't think you would like. So that would be my advice. Both going into college, try a lot of different areas, but also leaving college. Mentoring research is really interesting. Female leaders are more likely to invest in mentorship, both official and casual mentoring. Female leaders are also more likely to have diverse employees and diverse teams, both in terms of gender and in terms of race. Many of the women I talked to anecdotally talked about having male mentors. Part of that comes down to the fact that there aren't enough women in the most senior roles to mentor all the young women. 50% of the entering workforce is female. A very small percentage of the most senior women are female. So I would say everyone should have mentors of any gender, and mentorship should not just be of people of the same gender. I think it's very important to have diverse mentorship. There's some interesting research showing that the men who have the biggest networks, that tends to correlate with success. The women who have small but diverse networks, that is what correlates to success for women. I think what's really important is to break out of a traditional notion of sort of top-down mentorship. Your mentor is someone you work for, they advise you, and to think about it more in this concept of creating your own board of directors, people who can advise you, some of whom may be your peers, some of whom may be your peers in different industries, but not to think that you only can get professional advice and sort of nurturing from people who are more senior to you. And I think this idea of having a small but diverse network of people to coach you and to hold you accountable for your goals and priorities is really important. And I think that idea of a valuable network can in many ways supplement or complement this concept of traditional mentorship. So I would say build your networks. It takes I write in the book about how it takes a village, and everyone's assemblage of advisors is going to be different, and you're never going to get all the advice you need from just one person. But it's been really interesting to see how the women who have succeeded have cobbled together advice from different places and different types of advisors, many of whom may even be their peers.
Thank you so much, Julia. That's all the time we have, and I know you have other things that you need to do. So I just wanted to say we're very grateful. We have gratitude for you today. For coming
Thank you
and
so much. Really appreciate it. Bye.
Here early next week. And thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you online on CNBC. So thank you.